Have you ever noticed how some people don't need to shout to be heard? They step into a room, say a single sentence, and suddenly all eyes are on them. Not because they're the loudest or the most decorated, but because there's something in their presence that commands attention. Then there are others, good people, bright people, who speak and instantly become background noise. Their voices get lost, their thoughts overlooked, their energy dimmed before it even begins to rise. It's not about being better. It's not about being more. It's about how you carry your voice. It's about how you show up when you speak. And more often than not, it's about how you believe in the worth of what you have to say. There's something that many people don't realize is sabotaging them before they even speak. 2 words. Simple, seemingly harmless, but corrosive if used the wrong way. I'm sorry. Now, of course, apologies have their place. When you've hurt someone, when you've wronged them, when you've crossed the line, then yes, apologize. But most people don't use "I'm sorry" to make amends. They use it to shrink themselves, to preemptively submit, to soften their existence in a world that's already trying to smooth them down to something digestible. They say sorry when they walk into a room 2 minutes late after navigating chaos to get there. They say sorry when someone else bumps into them. They say sorry when they dare to share a thought, as if their voice is an inconvenience. But here's the thing. Every time you apologize for just being, you teach the world to overlook you. Every time you say sorry for existing, you give others permission to dismiss you. And if you do it long enough, you start believing that your presence needs justification, that your existence is somehow an inconvenience. There's nothing respectful about unnecessary apologies. What you're doing isn't humility, it's self-erasure. I learned this the hard way. I used to be the kind of person who apologized for everything. If someone interrupted me, I'd say sorry. If I had an opinion that challenged someone, I'd preface it with, "I'm sorry, but..." I was walking through life offering disclaimers for my presence. Until one day I heard myself apologize for something I didn't even do. And it clicked. I wasn't apologizing because I was wrong. I was apologizing because I was uncomfortable with being seen. It was then I started replacing "I'm sorry" with something else. With gratitude, with clarity, with presence. Instead of saying, "Sorry I'm late," I'd say, "Thank you for waiting." Instead of "Sorry to bother you," I'd ask, "Do you have a moment?" The shift was subtle, but the effect was powerful. Suddenly, I wasn't entering spaces as an inconvenience. I was entering them as someone who belonged there. And people noticed. It wasn't just about the words. It was about the energy behind them. When you stop apologizing for yourself, you start commanding a different kind of attention, one rooted in self-respect, one that says, "I know I matter and I don't need to shrink to prove it." And it's not just in apologies, it's in the way we let people overstep us in the name of being agreeable. It's in how we allow others to take more from us than they ever give, all while calling it kindness. Let's talk about boundaries. Because if your voice is going to carry weight, if your presence is going to command the room, then boundaries aren't optional. They're the foundation. A lot of people confuse setting boundaries with being harsh or selfish. But the truth is, boundaries aren't walls, they're bridges. They're not about keeping people out, they're about teaching people how to meet you with respect. When you don't set boundaries, what you're really saying is, "My peace doesn't matter. My time is invaluable. My energy is up for grabs." And people will treat it exactly that way. You think you're keeping the peace, but what you're really doing is slowly trading pieces of yourself for acceptance. And it doesn't work, because those who benefit from your lack of boundaries will never be the ones to honor your worth. I learned this from years of saying yes when I wanted to say no, of stretching myself thin so that others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. But the more I gave, the more they took. Until one day I looked at my calendar, at my life, and realized it wasn't mine anymore. I started small, saying no to things that didn't feel right, not offering elaborate excuses, just stating my limits. At first, people pushed back. Of course they did. They were used to the version of me who never pushed back. But when I held the line, something remarkable happened. They adjusted. They began to respect it. Not all of them stayed, but the ones who mattered did. And more importantly, I stayed. I stayed with myself. That's what boundaries do. They create space for you to remain intact. They draw the line between sacrifice and self-abandonment. And when you speak from a place of wholeness, people listen, not because you demand it, but because your presence becomes undeniable. And then there's silence, the kind of silence that most people fear, the kind of silence that happens between sentences, in the breath between thoughts, in the space where your words are meant to land. Most people rush to fill it. They think it makes them look unsure, but it's actually the opposite. Silence, when used with intention, is where your power lives. There's nothing louder than a well-timed pause. It's the moment that forces people to lean in, to pay attention, to digest what was just said. When you speak without pausing, it's like throwing pearls into the wind. No one catches them. They just scatter. But when you pause, even just for a heartbeat, your words begin to carry weight. I used to be the person who couldn't stand silence, who'd talk endlessly just to avoid the discomfort. I thought I was being thorough, but what I was really doing was burying my message under a mountain of noise. Until one day someone told me, "You don't need to say more. You just need to trust what you've already said." That changed everything. I started practicing intentional silence, not as manipulation, but as respect. Respect for my words, respect for the people listening, respect for the fact that every message needs room to breathe. And the more I did it, the more I noticed a shift. People weren't just hearing me, they were absorbing me. My words stopped being background noise and started becoming something that lingered. Not because I shouted louder, not because I said more, but because I trusted the space between the words to speak for me. So if you're someone who struggles to be heard, who feels like your words don't carry weight, ask yourself, am I filling the air or am I holding the room? Am I speaking to impress or am I speaking to connect? Because when you begin to speak from your center, not from fear, not from habit, but from presence, people don't just hear you, they feel you. And that's where respect begins. Not with volume, not with perfection, but with presence, with truth, with a voice that's no longer asking for permission to exist. There comes a moment in every life when you start to realize that being liked is not the same as being respected, that being accepted is not the same as being seen, and that being heard isn't about volume, it's about alignment. The truth is, many people walk through life trying to be agreeable, trying to be polite, trying to be liked by everyone. But in that desperate pursuit of approval, they erase themselves. They soften their voice until it disappears. They blur their identity until they forget where they end and others begin. And it feels safe for a while. The nods of approval, the absence of conflict, the sense of belonging. But over time, that safety becomes suffocating. You wake up one day and realize the life you're living is not yours. It's a performance, a beautifully polished mask that hides a voice that hasn't been heard in years. A voice that whispers in quiet moments, "Is this really me?" And if you're honest, you already know the answer. No, it isn't you. It's the version of you that was shaped by fear, by expectations, by stories that weren't even yours to begin with. The version of you that chose silence over truth, compliance over conviction, comfort over authenticity. But here's the thing about the real you, it never goes away. It waits. Beneath the performance, beneath the pleasing, beneath the fear, it waits for you to come home. And coming home to yourself isn't loud. It doesn't look like rebellion. It looks like clarity. Like finally saying no when your body is screaming for rest. Like letting go of relationships that only love the version of you that's easy to control. Like speaking your truth, and even if your voice shakes. Because that shake, that tremble, it means your voice is real again. It means it's coming from somewhere that matters. You begin to understand that not everyone deserves access to your truth, that your energy is not public property, that being available to everyone is the fastest way to lose yourself. You start to protect your peace like it's sacred, because it is. You begin to speak more slowly, more thoughtfully. You no longer rush to respond just to fill the silence. You let your words rise from within, like water from a still lake. And when they land, they ripple, not because they're loud, but because they're true. People notice this shift, even if they can't explain it. They feel it in the way you walk into a room without seeking validation, in the way you hold eye contact without flinching, in the way you no longer shrink to fit someone else's comfort. Your presence speaks before your words ever do. It says, I know who I am, and I don't need your approval to exist. And of course, it makes some people uncomfortable. That's the cost of reclaiming yourself. Not everyone benefits from your healing. Some people only knew how to love you when you were broken. Some only stayed because you made yourself small. But when you rise, when you speak, when you live aligned with truth, the room changes, the dynamics shift, and you have to be okay with letting go of anyone who doesn't respect who you're becoming. This isn't arrogance, this is self-respect. And self-respect is the soil where authentic voice grows. It's the foundation beneath every powerful message, every honest conversation, every real connection. Without it, your words fall flat. With it, they rise, carrying not just information, but energy. You start to realize that it's not about what you say, it's about how you say it. The tone, the breath, the stillness behind the sentence. People don't remember words. They remember how you made them feel. They remember whether your voice came from fear or truth, from obligation or freedom. And when your voice comes from truth, it doesn't need to be dressed up. It doesn't need fancy language or perfect grammar. It just needs to be yours. And the more you speak from that place, the more you begin to heal. Because every time you choose truth over silence, you stitch yourself back together. Every time you choose presence over performance, you reclaim another piece of your soul. And that reclamation becomes your power. You stop giving energy to conversations that go nowhere. You stop trying to convince people who aren't ready to hear. You start valuing your own time, your own voice, your own path. And in that honoring, you become magnetic. Not because you're trying to attract, but because you're finally aligned. This kind of alignment doesn't come from outside in. It comes from within, from asking hard questions, from sitting in discomfort, from peeling back the layers of who you thought you had to be and remembering who you actually are. And who you are is not weak, not too much, not too loud, not too quiet. You are a force, gentle, yes, but powerful, subtle maybe, but undeniable. And once you start speaking from that place, everything changes. Your relationships deepen. Your work becomes more meaningful. Your time feels sacred. You stop trying to be everything for everyone and start being everything for yourself. And here's the beautiful part. The people who are meant for you will rise to meet you there. You won't have to chase them. You won't have to explain yourself 100 times. They'll recognize you, not because you're familiar, but because you're real. And real always recognizes real. But even if they don't, you'll be okay. Because you finally stopped abandoning yourself. And that's what matters. That's what lasts. The voice you silenced for years is finally speaking. The truth you buried is rising. The life you were meant to live is unfolding. Not in chaos, but in clarity. Not in noise, but in presence. So speak, not to be loud, not to be right, but to be real. Speak because your voice matters. Speak because your story matters. Speak because silence is no longer an option. You've spent enough time whispering your truth into the wind. Now is the time to speak it into the world, with strength, with softness, with soul. And when you do, you'll find that your voice doesn't just change how others see you, it changes how you see yourself. You'll see not someone who's trying to be enough, but someone who already is. Not someone who needs to prove their worth, but someone who knows it. Not someone performing, but someone becoming. And that, above all else, is the voice the world needs most. There is a particular power that awakens the moment you stop needing to be understood. It's not bitterness, it's not detachment, it's clarity. A quiet, unwavering sense of self that says, I know who I am, and that's enough. Because the more you try to explain your soul to people committed to misunderstanding it, the more you dilute the essence of who you are. And you weren't born to be diluted. You were born to be deep, to be whole, to be felt in your fullness. You begin to understand that your voice isn't meant for every room. Your truth isn't meant for every table. And that's not a loss, it's alignment. Because the more you evolve, the more precise your presence becomes. You no longer scatter yourself across 100 conversations, hoping someone will hear you. You conserve your energy. You wait for spaces that can hold you. You speak when it matters. And in that restraint, your voice gains gravity. People confuse silence for weakness, but silence, when it's chosen, is sacred. There's a kind of silence that says more than noise ever could. A silence that comes from knowing that some things aren't worth your breath, that not every battle is yours to fight, that your peace is more valuable than being right. That silence is not surrender, it's sovereignty. And then there are the words you do choose, the ones you speak from a place of grounded truth, not from reactivity. You learned how to nod even when you disagreed, how to smile through discomfort, how to make yourself invisible in plain sight. But invisibility has a price, and the longer you live that way, the heavier the cost becomes. Until one day, the silence inside you becomes unbearable. Not because someone else broke it, but because your soul did. Because the part of you that remembers who you are, before the shame, before the filters, starts knocking. And this time, it's not asking, it's demanding. That's when the shift begins. Not all at once, and not without fear, but slowly. You start noticing the places where you disappear, the conversations where your truth stays locked in your throat, the moments you laugh when you really want to cry, agree when everything in you screams no, and you start asking why. Why am I still shrinking for rooms I've outgrown? Why do I soften my words when my truth is sharp for a reason? Why do I keep handing over my voice to people who never earned the right to hold it? And that's the moment, uncomfortable, sacred, when you begin to reclaim what was always yours. Your voice, not the one you built for survival, the one you buried for safety, the one you wrapped in apologies and hesitation, the one that got quieter every time someone rolled their eyes, changed the subject, or ignored your presence. No, not that one. The real one. The one that speaks in full sentences. That doesn't tremble with shame. That doesn't filter every word through a lens of acceptability. The voice that rises from your gut and carries the weight of everything you've lived through. That voice is not perfect. It is powerful because it is yours. And when you finally start using it, not to impress, not to provoke, but simply to be, you'll feel the ground shift beneath you. Some people will pull back. Not everyone loves the sound of truth, especially if they've built their comfort around your silence. Some will say you've changed, that you're difficult now, that you've become too intense, too honest, too real. Let them. Your voice was never meant to please everyone. It was meant to free you. And in that freedom, something beautiful happens. You stop seeking approval. You stop asking for permission. You start trusting yourself. You start speaking even when your voice shakes, because you know it's not about being fearless. It's about being faithful to your truth, to your integrity, to your aliveness. You begin to enter rooms not hoping to be accepted, but determined to be authentic. And authenticity doesn't always look graceful. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it stumbles. Sometimes it shakes. But it's real, and real is always enough. You learn how to disagree without apologizing, how to take up space without justification, how to share your perspective without twisting yourself into something palatable. Because you finally realized your job is not to be liked, it's to be honest. And honesty doesn't need to be cruel. It doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be clear. You don't have to convince anyone. You don't have to defend every word. You just have to stand in it with your chest open and your heart intact. And when you do, you'll attract people who speak the same language. People who don't flinch at your depth, who don't need you to play small, who listen, not just to your words, but to your soul. And you'll start to notice that the more you speak your truth, the more others do too. Your courage becomes contagious. Your honesty becomes a mirror. Your presence gives others permission to come out of hiding. And without meaning to, you begin to build a new kind of space. A space where voices aren't just tolerated, but celebrated. Where silence is no longer survival, but choice. Where people aren't just heard, but held. That kind of space doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. It requires people brave enough to show up with their mess, with their questions, with their unpolished truth. And when you become that person, when you choose to be real over being right, you change everything. Because the world doesn't need more experts. It needs more people willing to speak from the middle of their becoming. People who say, I don't have it all figured out, but here's what's real for me. That kind of voice pierces through the noise. It doesn't demand attention, it earns it, because it carries the one thing everyone is secretly longing for, honesty. So speak, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Speak not because you owe anyone an explanation, but because you owe yourself your own presence. Speak to remember who you are. Speak to reclaim the pieces you gave away in exchange for peace that never lasted. Speak not for performance, but for liberation. Because the most radical thing you can do in a world that profits from your silence is to speak with your full chest, with your whole heart, without shrinking. And the most healing thing you can do in a world that's forgotten how to listen is to speak in a way that can be felt, not just heard. There comes a time when you stop asking for your voice to be heard and start choosing to hear it yourself. Not because others finally recognize your value, but because you stopped waiting for recognition. Because you reached that moment where the cost of silence became too steep, where swallowing your truth felt like swallowing shards of your own soul, where you realized that waiting for permission was just another way of keeping yourself invisible. You start to notice how much of your life was shaped by fear. Not the obvious kind that shouts, but the quiet kind that whispers, what if they don't like you? What if they leave? What if they laugh? And so, you learn to edit, to hesitate, to soften your edges. You presented versions of yourself that were easier to digest, easier to love. And you told yourself it was kindness. But deep down, you knew it was survival. You didn't want to be alone. You didn't want to be the one who rocked the boat. You didn't want to be labeled too much. So you toned it down. Your emotions, your ideas, your fire. Until one day you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize who was looking back. Because somewhere in the pursuit of acceptance, you lost the thread of your own voice. And when that realization hits, it doesn't scream. It hums. A quiet ache in your chest. A subtle weight in your bones. a deep knowing that something essential has been left behind. And no matter how many people applaud your performance, the silence in your spirit gets louder. That silence isn't your enemy. It's your signal. It's the part of you that remembers, the part that knows you weren't made to shrink, that you weren't built for obedience. You were born for honesty, that your voice wasn't given to you to blend in. It was given to you to illuminate. And so you begin again. Not with a declaration, but with a whisper. You start by speaking your truth in rooms that feel safe, then in rooms that don't. You start by saying no to what drains you, then by saying yes to what sets your soul on fire. You begin to reclaim what was always yours, your voice, your space, your rhythm. And as you do, you realize something powerful. Your voice was never the problem. The problem was the places that didn't know how to hold it. The people who only listen to respond, not to understand. The systems that benefit from your silence. The dynamics that were never built for your wholeness. You were not too loud. They were just too used to quiet. You were not too emotional. They were just too uncomfortable with feeling. You were not too complex. They were just too conditioned to accept simplicity. And suddenly you stop apologizing, not because you've hardened, but because you've healed. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stop performing for approval because your value is not up for debate. You begin to speak with a different kind of clarity, one that doesn't demand attention, but commands presence. Your words don't shout, they land. Your sentences don't race, they linger. You're no longer speaking to prove. You're speaking to connect, to express, to release. And when you speak from that place of wholeness, of alignment, of embodied truth, your voice becomes a mirror. It reflects the truth back to others, not to shame them, but to awaken them, to remind them of what's possible when you stop hiding, when you stop pretending, when you stop being afraid of your own power. Because there's nothing more magnetic than someone who speaks without apology. Not out of arrogance, but out of presence. Not to dominate, but to liberate. You start to notice how the world begins to respond. Not always kindly, not always immediately, but differently. You begin to attract what resonates with truth, and you lose what was only ever held together by your silence. And yes, the losses sting, but the gains, they breathe. You find people who look you in the eyes and don't flinch, who meet you where you are, not where they wish you'd stay, who don't ask you to shrink, to bend, to soften what was never meant to be erased. These are the ones who recognize your voice not as a disruption, but as a rhythm, not as a threat, but as a melody they've been waiting to hear. And slowly you begin to build a life around that resonance, around spaces where your voice is not just tolerated, but needed, where your truth doesn't echo back as silence, but as understanding, where you no longer have to ask, is it okay if I say this? Because you know, if it's true, it belongs. This doesn't mean you'll never doubt again. Doubt is part of the process. It visits to test your commitment. It whispers when your voice starts rising, but you'll learn to speak anyway, not because you're fearless, but because you're faithful to the version of you that refuses to go silent again. And that version of you, the one who chooses to speak through the fear, through the trembling, through the uncertainty, that version becomes your anchor. You'll begin to stand taller, not because you figured it all out, but because you're no longer trying to disappear. You're here, fully, boldly, softly. You're here in your voice, in your truth, in your story. And you'll begin to understand that your voice is not just a tool. It's a return to the parts of you that never stopped hoping you come back. So speak, for the version of you who stayed quiet to survive. Speak, for the wounds that need air to heal. Speak for the stories that deserve to be heard, even if the only one listening is you. Because once you begin to speak from your truth, your voice is no longer just sound. It becomes a flame. It becomes a compass. It becomes home. There is a moment when everything you've been holding inside finally catches up to you. Not as a breakdown, not as an explosion, but as a realization so still, so quiet, it almost feels like peace. That's when you know your silence was never empty. It was full of everything you didn't say. Every swallowed truth, every "I'm fine" that meant the opposite. Every nod, every smile, every time you bit your tongue to keep the peace that was costing you your own. You carry that weight for so long it starts to feel like it belongs. You forget what it feels like to speak without second-guessing, to stand up without apologizing, to walk into a room and not immediately scan it for approval. You forget that your voice was once wild and free, that before the world told you how to speak, what to think, who to be, you already knew that knowing doesn't die. It dims, it retreats, it hides beneath layers of adaptation, accommodation, and fear. But it never leaves, and eventually it begins to stir. Often at the most inconvenient times, in the middle of a meeting, in a quiet moment alone, in the company of someone who sees through the version of you the world applauds. It stirs not to shame you, but to invite you back to the truth of who you are, back to the voice you buried, back to the words you wrote in journals but never said out loud. That invitation doesn't come with instructions. It comes with questions, soft ones at first, then sharper, louder, until you can't ignore them anymore. Why are you still shrinking in places you've outgrown? Why are you still explaining your truth to people who only hear what they want? Why are you still asking for permission to be yourself? And once you start answering those questions honestly, the unraveling begins. The shedding of roles, the breaking of patterns, the letting go of what once protected you, but now suffocates you. It's terrifying, because the moment you start speaking your truth, everything false begins to fall away. You lose people, you lose comforts, you lose identities. But what you gain, what you finally breathe into, makes every loss worth it. You gain congruence, you gain presence, you gain yourself. And when you speak now, it sounds different. Not because your words have changed, but because your energy has. Your voice doesn't just come from your mouth anymore. It comes from your chest, from your belly, from your bones. It comes from the parts of you that are done pretending. And that voice, it doesn't ask to be accepted. It doesn't wait to be invited. It shows up, not to perform, not to impress, but to be real. And being real becomes your new rhythm, your new home, your new baseline. Not everyone will understand. That's okay. Not everyone is supposed to. Because your voice is not a product. It's not a strategy. It's not here to be packaged for consumption. It's here to be lived, to be trusted, to be felt. You no longer speak to fill space. You speak to create space for honesty, for healing, for liberation. You speak not to dominate, but to resonate. And your resonance cannot be faked. It cannot be rushed. It comes from sitting with your silence long enough to know what's worth saying. You realize that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is, "I don't know," or "Man, I need help," or "This isn't working for me anymore." You stop mistaking strength for silence and start recognizing strength in softness, in clarity, in vulnerability. And in that space, your voice becomes a tool of discernment. It becomes a compass, pointing you toward what feels real. It becomes a sound of boundaries being honored, of desires being named, of truths being reclaimed. You stop speaking to avoid conflict. You start speaking to avoid regret. You stop hiding behind over-explaining. You start trusting that your truth is enough. You stop giving rehearsed answers. You start offering real presence. And when people speak to you, you listen differently because you know what it feels like to not be heard. You know the courage it takes to be honest. So you listen for what isn't said. You honor the pauses. You meet others with the same grace you're learning. Rest over proving, presence over pleasing. Because you've been taught your whole life that love is something you earn, that you must shapeshift to deserve it, that you must stay quiet, stay small, stay agreeable. And every time you did, they said, "Good job." But what they were really saying was, "Thank you for not threatening the system." But your truth is a threat to systems built on silence. Your voice is a disruption to patterns built on pretending. Your existence, as you truly are, is revolutionary. Not because it's loud or flashy, but because it refuses to betray itself. And in a world that rewards the mask, choosing to be real is the bravest thing you can do. You don't have to know what's next. You just have to stop betraying what's now. You don't have to burn everything down, but you do have to stop feeding what starves you. You don't have to be fearless. You just have to be willing to move with your fear instead of waiting for it to disappear. And slowly your life will begin to mirror your truth. Not instantly, not all at once, but gradually and unmistakably. The spaces you once shrank in will feel too tight. The conversations you once tolerated will feel too shallow. The roles you once performed will feel too heavy. Not because you're becoming ungrateful, but because you're becoming aware. Aware of the energy it takes to perform. Aware of the cost of your compliance. Aware that your life has been waiting all this time for you to step into it with both feet. You'll start saying no, not out of rebellion, but out of reverence. Reverence for your time, your peace, your truth. You'll start saying yes, not out of obligation, but out of alignment. Yes to what excites your soul. Yes to what expands your spirit. Yes to what feels like home. And the more you choose from that place, the more your life becomes yours. Not a replica, not a compromise, but a masterpiece of your own making. People will say you've changed, and they're right. You have. You've stopped living from reaction and started living from intention. You've stopped moving from fear and started moving from knowing. You've stopped existing on autopilot and started waking up. This is what awakening feels like. Not like bliss, but like breaking. Like being cracked open and finding yourself in the pieces. Like no longer tolerating what once felt normal. Like realizing you've been sleepwalking through a life that was never truly yours. And now you're here, awake, raw, real. Don't rush this. Don't try to fix it. Just feel it. Let the grief rise. Let the anger flow. Let the confusion unravel. These are not signs that something is wrong. These are signs that something real is emerging. You are not broken. You are breaking open. And the world needs more open hearts. Hearts that feel deeply, speak truthfully, love fiercely, live fully. Not hearts that perform, not hearts that please, hearts that pulse with the rhythm of authenticity. So breathe, trust, keep going. You're not behind, you're not lost. You're just walking a path that few have the courage to follow. And every step you take, every truth you honor, every mask you lay down, you become more of who you were always meant to be. Not perfect, not polished, but powerful. Because power doesn't come from control. It comes from alignment, from living in harmony with your own soul. And your soul, it's not interested in the rules. It's not impressed by titles. It's not here to be validated. It's here to be expressed fully, unapologetically, authentically. And now finally it is. Somewhere between forgetting and remembering, between what the world told you and what your soul whispers late at night, you begin to understand what it really means to live. Not survive, not impress, not perform, but live in that raw, unfiltered, honest kind of way that has nothing to prove and everything to feel. You stop searching for life in places that always leave you emptier. You stop chasing people who only love the version of you that stays small. You stop waiting for permission to do what your heart has been aching to do for years. There's a point where you realize that growth doesn't always feel like a breakthrough. Sometimes it feels like a breakdown. Like everything safe and familiar is falling apart. Like the roles you've mastered suddenly make you sick. Like the life you worked so hard to build no longer fits who you're becoming. And in that unraveling, you're tempted to turn back, to run to the comfort of old patterns, to put the mask back on and pretend it still fits. But something deep inside you knows it doesn't. Because once you've tasted truth, even in the smallest dose, illusion becomes unbearable. That's the quiet courage it takes to evolve. Not the kind people cheer for, not the kind you post online, but the kind that lives in the background of your daily choices. The kind that whispers, "Don't betray yourself again." The kind that stands between the old you and the becoming one, protecting something sacred even when no one else sees it. And there will be times when no one sees it. When your evolution confuses the people around you. When your refusal to shrink is labeled as defiance. When your healing looks like distance. When your clarity looks like rebellion. They may not understand, they may not support you, but that's okay. Understanding isn't required for you to be free. Approval isn't needed for you to be real. Not everyone will go with you. That's one of the hardest truths to accept on the path to becoming. That love can be real and still not be enough. That connection doesn't always equal compatibility. That loyalty to others sometimes requires disloyalty to yourself. And that the most honest thing you'll ever do is walk away from what doesn't honor who you're growing into. Even if it once felt like home, you'll grieve, you'll question, you'll ache. But beneath all of that, a new kind of strength will start to rise. The kind that doesn't shout but holds. The kind that doesn't need to convince anyone. The kind that simply knows, I am allowed to choose myself. I am allowed to grow beyond what once held me. I am allowed to change the story, even if it makes others uncomfortable. And slowly, you'll begin to rewrite the narrative, not just of your life, but of your worth. You'll stop measuring your value by how much you do or how well you please. You'll stop viewing rest as laziness and softness as weakness. You'll begin to see that your presence is enough, that your being matters more than your doing, that your existence, exactly as it is a gift. This is not some shallow self-love trend. This is the deep, messy, soul-level work of returning to yourself after years of detours. It's not glamorous. It's not linear. Some days you'll feel on fire. Other days you'll doubt every step you've taken. But even in those moments, you're still healing, still growing, still choosing truth over safety. And that choice, even when quiet, is revolutionary. You'll start to notice the subtle ways the world opens up when you live from your truth. Conversations feel deeper, time feels slower, joy feels richer. And not because your circumstances have changed, but because you have. You've stopped resisting who you are. You've started allowing life to meet you where you actually live, in your fullness, not your performance. And you'll find people who speak your language, people who aren't afraid of your depth, who don't ask you to dim your light, who don't flinch at your darkness. They won't need you to be anything but exactly who you are. And with them, you'll exhale in ways you didn't know you were holding your breath. Not because you finally became lovable, but because you finally stopped hiding. This is what real love feels like. Not performance, not possession, but presence. Real love doesn't demand that you sacrifice your soul to be kept. It meets you there, where your truth lives, and says, I see you, all of you, and I'm not going anywhere. But you won't wait for it anymore. You'll no longer build your life around the hope of being chosen, because you've already chosen yourself. And in that choice, you found the peace that nothing external can give or take away. A peace that lives in your breath, in your bones, in the way you carry yourself when no one's watching. And that peace becomes your compass. You'll stop hustling for worthiness. Stop rushing through life as if peace is something you earn at the end. You'll begin to trust the timing of your life, not the timeline they gave you, not the one that says success must happen by 30, or love must look a certain way, or healing should follow a straight path. You'll trust that your life is unfolding exactly as it needs to, and in that trust you'll find grace. Grace for your past, for the choices you made when you didn't know better. Grace for your present, for the mess and the magic of becoming. Grace for your future, for the unknowns that still await. Grace becomes the new rhythm, not pushing, not punishing, just honoring the truth of what it means to be human. You will still fall, you will still falter, but now you'll rise differently. Not out of fear, but out of love. Not to prove anything, but to remember everything you are. You'll rise not with the weight of the world on your shoulders, but with the wisdom of having laid it down. And in your rising, others will rise too. Not because you saved them, but because your truth gave them permission to save themselves. This is how it works. This is how we heal the world. One person at a time, choosing truth over comfort, courage over convenience, becoming instead of performing. You are that person. Right now, not when you're more healed, not when you figured it all out. Right now, in your mess, in your magic, in your becoming. You don't need more time. You don't need to wait for the perfect moment. You are the moment, you are the miracle, and your life, unfolding exactly as it is,